Hi, I'm Wendy from Shiny Happy World, and this is the new pattern for the Funny Faces Quilt Block of the Month pattern. And when I say the new pattern, it is now the middle of December. It's December 15th, 2020. So he is going to be exclusive to the Funny Faces Quilt Block of the Month Club until January 15th, 2021, at which point there will be a new pattern available. So for this month, it is the Snow Monkey. And I'm going to show you how to put them together. But first, I just want to give you a nutshell, super fast version of my Quilt As You Go method because it's a little different than what most people do. It would probably be more accurate for me to call it a mostly quilt as you go, because I do a little bit of quilting at the end. But I start out by just quilting the background block to the batting. So you can see I've got the batting exposed on the back, and you can see that the quilt lines go all the way across the block. I do the quilting before I do the applique. So I do all of the quilting first, then I do the applique, which is what I'm going to show you in these videos. And then when I'm done, I trim the block to size, sew all the blocks together, press those seams open to eliminate bulk, although the thin cotton batting really does not give as much bulk as you think it would. Then I layer on the backing and just do one more round of quilting just along those seam lines joining the blocks. If you're going to run the entire mass of your quilt through the machine, the easiest time to do that is when you're just doing some straight lines that go edge to edge. So that's what I do. Just kind of for reference, I can do a nap size quilt, which is the size I like to use on the couch, in about a half an hour. So I can wrestle my quilt through the machine for a half an hour, the entire quilt. But that allows me to do more. This isn't very fancy quilting inside, but sometimes I do a lot of curvy lines and swirls and things, and that is much easier to navigate when you're just doing just the block. And also all of the outlining that I do around these applique pieces, that is much easier to do when it's just on the block. All of those points that you're twisting and spinning and turning. So that is just the nutshell version of my mostly quilt as you go method. Now I'm going to show you how to make the Snow Monkey block. Okay, the first thing you're going to need to do is print out your pattern. This guy is kind of big, so he prints out on 2 sheets of paper. He has water in there, and anything that goes edge to edge on the block always takes up a little bit of extra room. Plus his head is very shaggy and very big. So if you're printing it on regular paper, then you'll want to trace it onto the paper side of paper-backed fusible adhesive. I'm really lazy, so I like to use printable sheets so I can print directly onto the paper. This is, everybody always asks, this is the brand I use. I use Heat and Bond, and I use Lightweight for all of my quilts. It's soft enough to be really comfortable to snuggle under, but sturdy enough that it can go through the washer and dryer without any problem. So get your pattern onto the paper side of your fusible adhesive, and then roughly cut out around all of the pieces. And when I say roughly, I mean not right on the line. You want to leave a little bit of room on the edges of all of the pieces. So roughly cut out all of the pieces. Let me get these out of the way so you can see a little more clearly. And fuse them to the wrong side of the fabric. And just follow the directions for whatever brand adhesive you are using. So for this guy, here are the pieces. You've got the muzzle and the face, and in real life, these are always pink. These monkeys are gray and they have a very pink face, but I'm not doing mine in realistic colors. I am making a green monkey. So you're gonna have a muzzle and a face that are both gonna be in the face color. You're gonna have shoulders and a head, which should be in the same color, but I'm doing 2 different shades of that color. I like to imagine that his shoulders, which I drew as smooth instead of shaggy like his head, because I'm imagining that he's sitting in the water, and so the bottom half of him has gotten wet. So it's a little bit of a darker color and has the smoother sides. There's a little strip of water at the bottom that's going to go at the bottom of the block. And you thought you were going to get away without doing any eyes because he's got these blissful, happy, closed eyes, but he does have some very small nostril pieces, and I always just do those on solid black fabric. So get all of those pieces roughly cut out, fused to the wrong side of your fabric, and then we'll come back and I'll talk about why you do that rough cut first. Okay, the next step is to cut all the pieces out neatly, and that means cut them all out on the solid lines. All of the dotted lines are just indicating the placement of other pieces. So you want to cut them all out on the solid line. And the reason that you do this after you fuse, right now the fusible adhesive goes all the way to the cut edge of the paper. And if you were to cut it exactly on the line, then you would have to try and cut it exactly again on that line. And you might be off by a little bit, and that can lead to the fabric fraying. So by cutting it out roughly first and having that adhesive go past the edge where you want it to be, means when you go back and do your clean cut later after fusing, it makes absolutely sure that that adhesive is going right up, covering every single thread right up to the cut edge. So after you get all of your all of your pieces cut out neatly, there's one more step and then we get to the fun part. So the last thing you need to do before we peel off the paper backing and put all of these pieces in place is all of these dotted lines show placement. We need to transfer them to the fabric side of the fabric. So if you hold this piece up, fabric side facing you, and you put it in a window, you can see these lines right through the fabric, even if it's a dark colored fabric, and then you can trace the lines right onto the fabric. So I use a couple of different tools for this. The first thing I always trace is anything that's the lines or placement markings that are going to be covered up with black. So these eyes, I'm going to stitch right over them with black thread, and the nostrils I'm going to cover with black fabric applique pieces, so I don't need to worry about black lines showing through a lighter colored fabric. So I do all of that with just a plain fine tip Sharpie. So on these, I've transferred the nostrils and the mouth and the eyes. Now there's other dotted lines here that just show how the pieces fit together. Those you need to do with something that's erasable. The permanent line for this is fine because I'm going to just stitch right over it with black. But for everything else, you do need something that is erasable. And I use two different options. So whenever possible, I use just a white chalk. So you can see that on this fabric, I've transferred this marking that shows where the muzzle goes, this marking. On most of these, I've been able to do it. I can see it. I'm not sure how clearly it shows up in the video, but I can see it with the chalk. And that is my preference if that's an option. If the fabric is too light and the chalk isn't going to show, I'll use a pencil, just a plain Ticonderoga pencil. Nothing fancy. And I did this here because I wasn't sure these lines were going to show up for you on the video. So I did want to show the pencil option. So I've done these face markings with the pencil. So the one thing about the pencil though, it is erasable, but I use a white eraser for it. I don't use the eraser that is built into the pencil because it has color in it. And the pencil line can be erased completely, but sometimes the colored eraser will leave a little bit of a smudge behind. This is just a very inexpensive artist's eraser. You can get them at any art supply store or craft store, Joann's, places like that. And they erase everything really, really well. So I'll use that to erase actually pencil lines and chalk lines. So transfer all of those markings to the front side of the fabric. I transferred this dotted line down here too, but I did it just in the white chalk line. So get all of those transferred, and then we get to the fun part, and that is layering and building the face. All right, now for the fun part, putting it together. So you're going to peel off the paper backing. This is why it's really important that you do that transfer step before you peel off that paper backing, because now we've lost all the markings on the back. And you line up the bottom cut edge of his shoulders with the raw edge at the bottom of your block. And I may need to shift that just a little bit once I get the water in place, because that is next. So I peel off the water backing. And then I'm going to lay this one also with the cut edge at the bottom. And I've got some markings here that I transferred that show where the water lines up with the shoulders. And I think, and also where it overlaps. So I'm just gonna shift these shoulders up just a smidge to get that in there. Okay, that is perfect. Now for his big furry face. And then this, I've drawn lines here that shows how much it overlaps. So that's the placement marking that you see on the shoulders. And that tells you, without you having to lift it all over all of these points and make sure that you've got enough overlap. Now you can see very clearly that you've got enough overlap. So his chin is just barely out of the water. Then I'm going to put his muzzle in place. Right there. And then his eyes. These actually tuck behind the muzzle. I could have put them down first. And I've got these markings that show how much. So once the muzzle overlaps that line, and I've got it lined up on each side, I know I've got that in the right place. And now, just those teeny tiny little nostrils. One there. Oh, and the paper just flew off of that one. And put that one there. And he is all ready to fuse. So I'm going to take him over to the ironing board, just double check everything and make sure I've got everything exactly where I want it. Then I'm going to follow the package directions, follow the directions for whatever brand you're using, get that fused into place. I let it cool on the ironing board, and then I take it to the sewing machine and do all of my outline stitching, and then I'll come back here and talk you through the path that I took for the outline stitching and show you a couple of samples in other color options, including a realistic gray monkey. Okay, here he is all finished. Now I'm going to just talk you quickly through the path that I took to outline him. I do all of my outlining. I go 3 times around each piece, and I don't try and get exactly on top of my previous lines. I want it to look sketchy, like it just came out of my sketchbook. So I started by just doing the top of the water. So I started on one side and went 1, 2, 3, and then tied it off. Then I did around his shaggy head, and I started on this little shaggy piece right above his shoulder. And I went 3 times around his head, around all of those points. That's definitely the most time-consuming part. Then I continued past where I had started and then started doing this side of his shoulder. So 1, 2, 3. And then I did a 4th row of stitching across the top of the water. You can't see the difference between 3 rows and 4 rows, so it makes a nice little shortcut. And then I went 1, 2, 3, and tied it off. And then for around his face, I started on this side. I did his muzzle first and started on this side and went around once, twice, 3 times, continued past where I started, and then did around the top of his head once, twice, 3 times. So for the eyes and the mouth, there's really nothing for it. You just have to do each of them 3 times and tie off. And for the nostrils, I just go around each nostril 1 time since it's black stitching on black fabric. You can't see the stitching, so the 3 rows doesn't do any good. That 1 round of stitching is really just enough to keep it secured so that I can wash it in the washing machine and not worry about the pieces coming loose. So here he is in kind of a silly green version. And I also did a more realistic version here. So he's got the very white fur around his face and the slightly darker shoulders. Technically they have a pink face, but that just looked really weird when I did it in fabric. So I just gave him, I used a beige fabric that had just like a little bit of a peachy color to it. So it still has that warm, cool contrast. And that to me was much more realistic looking monkey. And then I did one more silly color. And that is a silly purple monkey. And for him also, I gave him kind of a pinkish, purplish face just to get that warm, cool contrast again. So that is the Japanese snow monkey pattern. That's the new Funny Faces Quilt Block of the Month pattern. I'm Wendy from Shiny Happy World, and I'll see you next month.